Hi, and welcome to this NPTEL course titled Trauma and Literature, where we're looking at this novel, Nervous Conditions. We begin to wind up the story, the reading of the story, and we're looking at an essay which sort of captures the whole novel in very complex ways. So if you remember the last session, we were sort of examining the way space and identity and gender and agency these become connected categories. So we'll just carry on from that point. This should be on your screen. So again, the house becomes not just a physical place, but also a psychological space, which has very deep and complex gendered mappings, which are connected to education, agency, liberation, identity, etc. Unlike Namu's colorful narrative, Tambu's critique of the house engages its physical and interior peculiarities. Her analysis foregrounds why such a social construction and its equally socially constructed deity would be incapable of guarding and promoting the physical and mental health of its woman residents, particularly. So we saw how the godlike quality is a culturally constructed quality, and that obviously is reflective of the deep-seated patriarchy in this society. And the house becomes almost like a god residence, a mansion for the god, and that obviously controls and becomes some kind of site of surveillance from which the gendered qualities, the gender identities are controlled and coerced. So while Tambu details the house's material trappings and notes that Baba Mukuru has made himself plenty of power, plenty of money, a lot of education, plenty of everything, she in retrospect recognizes that this house lacks in a number of ways and thus could benefit from some structural ideological repair. Right, so the repetition of the word plenty is interesting over here. Plenty of power, plenty of money, a lot of education, plenty of everything. So we can see how the hegemonic masculinity in the novel is obviously a construct which is culturally formed, invested with power and money and education and this overabundance of everything. So the plenitude, shall we say, becomes very much part of the hegemonic dominant masculine identity, which is obviously a perpetuation of patriarchy to a large extent. However, we can see how the retrospective recognition of the house also makes the character realize that it requires a lot of repair, structural repair, as well as ideological repair. So some kind of a revision is required in the house. So there are some structural architectural repair. At the same time, there are some discursive repairs to this house. And again, we're looking at a house as a physical place as well as an ideological space, a discursive space. So some kind of a remapping is required for that space to be more inclusive in quality. First, so again, we look at the way how the physical place and the mental space, discursive space, keep converging in very complex ways. First, the house's interior is so opulently decorated, it is almost stuffy. So stuffy, there's a degree of claustrophobia which emerges out of overabundance. It's so opulent, so full of things. And again, this fullness and plenitude of things becomes a marker of masculinity, a marker of hegemonic masculinity. It's almost stuffy. In addition, as does its exterior, lone white paint, the house's layout speaks of dominance and arrogance. Like the deity who rules in it, and sometimes from its intimidating dining table, throne, the house is an imposing presence to everything, to which everything else is tangential. The grounds were very large, Tambu reports. In them stood a single building, Baba Mukuru's house, if you do not count the outlying constructions, which turn out to be a shed, a garage, and a servant's quarters. Right, so we can see how the mapping of the house obviously becomes some kind of a discursive diagram in terms of laying out the identity politics over here. So who occupies or who inhabits the central position of the house and who are the ones in the margin can be seen in terms of the construction. So again, we're looking at how the architecture of a particular place has a lot of discursive mappings, discursive encodings embedded in it. And of course, the house becomes a sort of a microcosmic reflection of society, where there's a man at the center and the servants are the margins and the women are hardly visible. So the invisibility of the woman and the hypervisibility of the man obviously reflects the cultural and discursive conditions, which is reflected by this house. While the smaller size of the shed, garage, and the servants' quarters serves to bolster the house's physical stature among its peers, the same way, the small, voiceless female earthlings in Baba Mukuru's life become mere appendages that amplify its providential position. The kitchen reveals its aesthetic, structural, and by extension, ideological blemishes, right? So we can see how there are certain portions in the house which are not aesthetic, which are not strong enough, where there's certain other positions which are inhabited by Brahma Mukuru. That is a privileged position in the house. So the zonal quality of the privilege in the house, that is reflective of the zonal, the gendered quality of that privilege as well. So Baba Mukuru is the deity in the house. So he occupies the central position, and everything else, the servants and the woman, they occupy the marginal position. So that is again reflective of the society. The kitchen had earlier appeared sophisticated to Tambu. On closer scrutiny, however, it looks the opposite, as is a homestead kitchen which is so run down it would be difficult to find a dry spot, some safe space, when it rains. My Guru's kitchen, Wright notes as well, is symbolically in a state of dilapidation. Tambu's redescription of the kitchen discloses the sense of incompleteness, chaos, and gender inequity that mar the interior of Baba Mukuru's whitened kingdom, right? So the kitchen space, which is traditionally in a very sexist way, the female space, that seems to be dilapidated, that seems to be in a state of requiring repair. But what's interesting over here is how the kitchen had appeared big to Tambu earlier, and now on a retrospective narration, on closer look, she recognizes the repairs which are required in that kitchen. So that is an important symbolic point, that the kitchen requires repair. So that becomes reflective of the gender inequity, right? Because the interior of the house, the domestic space, the drawing room space where Baba Mukuru resides, that is obviously very grand. But then the kitchen and the servants' quarters become the marginal spaces. Okay, so through the image of the missing pane, for instance, Dangarembga shows the heaven's imperfection. She, moreover, points to the atmosphere of vulnerability which Baba Mukuru, as officer in charge, has allowed to afflict the kitchen, a creative space, gendered gently in Shona, as a result of the kingdom's inability to rectify a structural or gender-related problem. So the problem of gender is reflected in the problem of the kitchen space, right? So again, we can see how the spatial quality and the gendered quality converge in a novel, continuously converge in a novel. So the identity of gender, or the gender identity, is informed by the spatial mappings. So the kitchen, the state of the kitchen, is reflective of the state of the woman, because it's a woman who traditionally and conventionally and a patriarchal way occupy the kitchen space. So that space, the quality of the space is a reflection of the quality of the gender. It is interesting, perhaps not accidental, that this pane is missing from a section of the house which the novel associates with women mainly, whether they are, unlike the family's unattached young men, congestedly sleeping in it, cooking for everybody, or negotiating a fierce sisterly solidarity during a male-dominated family jurisprudence regarding Lucia's pregnancy. The kitchen is also a place where women could wield authority and use food as leverage in marital politics. But a pane is missing. It surprises me, my Guru says, concerning the damaged and hence vulnerable kitchen. So you can see how the condition of the kitchen, the condition of the female space, becomes very much reflective of the condition of the gendered difference and discrimination and inequality in the society. So the broken window pane becomes a very symbolic presence via absence. So that again, the play between presence and absence becomes interesting. So Tambu says the broken window, the drought, and its consequences were particularly annoying to my Guru. But the fact that my Guru does not fix the windows herself or demand that they get repaired, that the oppressive male patriarchal ideology and attitude coded in that damage be changed, is a major authorial commentary on gender self-disempowerment. So, the fact that the window pane cannot be repaired unless the male authorizes it is again part of the traumatic condition. I mean, we're not talking about trauma through an accident. We're talking about trauma as a dailiness, as a daily occurrence, right? So that sense of being disempowered becomes interesting over here. So my Guru's troubling inaction, shown also in our apathy on the Lucia situation, insinuates a acquiescence to Baba Mukuru's culture-supported male leadership and dominion, and hence signifies the indirect complicity in her subordination. So she becomes I mean, she's sort of ruled by consent in a certain sense. And also she colludes with patriarchy. So Migra's collusion with patriarchy, she becomes a willing subject of patriarchy, right? And so she doesn't subvert the patriarchal norms, rather she insinuates and she consolidates it through her subordination and complicity. As Hugh Thomas observes correctly, Migra's submissiveness and want of autonomy inflate Baba Mukuru's divinity. So the whole male divine presence is sort of flacked up and fanned and amplified by the complicity and submissiveness of Miguru. Although Dangarembga indirectly condemns Miguru's passivity in this case, she hints even more on the complexity, rootedness, strength and undisrupted normalcy of a novel's patriarchal structure. Dangarembga comments on how a woman so educated, stable financially, and exposed culturally could still be made to feel like nothing in a family as she, as head wife, works herself sick to support. So it's a purely supportive presence, despite the education, despite the supposed exposure. Miguru remains just a merely passive supportive presence in this patriarchal framework. She suggested that until that Miguru's out there become more proactive and demanding an effective change, until they initiate moves to have their impaired kitchens fixed, as Tambu and Lucia do when the person repair the homestead kitchen, their aspirations would keep getting thwarted, right? So the unfixed kitchen, the unrepaired kitchen becomes a very symbolic space, a very symbolic site. And of course, it gets repaired in the end with Tambu and Lucia. So there's an intergenerational quality about female agency, an intergenerational quality in terms of empowerment and appropriation of authority. The cakes and buns they bake would never be quite light as desired. Speaking figuratively, however, that a kitchen remains clean in spite of its structural and aesthetic flaws could be read as Miguru's intent to remain sane, to make peace with the condition, with that what amounts to the invasion through male societal negligence and sabotage of a woman creative space. Right. So, despite the sabotage, the kitchen just remains clean at best. And that the sort of state of making it clean is just the ultimate agency the Miguru has, or is willing to exercise, right? And that willingness to comply to the patriarchal demands, to comply to the patriarchal codes, it very much becomes part of the tragedy in this novel, part of the nervous condition in the novel, which creates this claustrophobia in an intergenerational framework. Tambu, in fact, alludes early in the novel and at other times to this problem of manifold assault on an impairment of woman's space, a disruption of woman's freedom and ability to own, control, and enjoy even the very marginal spaces to which they have been relegated undeservedly. In some cases, this violation becomes a path to socio-economic and male progress. The spatial infringement is evident, for instance, in what happens when the colonial administration decides to build its district council houses close to the women's washing section in a village's river, Namira. Right, so the building of the council house, which is again typically public male space, right beside the women's washing section and the village's river, which is Namirara, that becomes again a very symbolic site through which the male surveillance and control and coercion is exercised, enacted, and perpetuated. This development not only upsets the native landscape, but also the entrepreneurial, commercial, and recreational activities it generates among the villages leads to the women's washing places becoming thoroughfares for people going to Magrosa for all sorts of reasons. As thoroughfares they become, in other words, an open and vulnerable passage walked upon by those headed somewhere else. According to Tambu, the woman liked the spot because it was sensibly architectured for doing laundry, but this infraction forces a woman out to become an alternate bathing location, right? So it forces a woman to find a different location. Now, what this means is also becomes a symbolic invasion of space. And of course, it's no surprise this is a colonial building, a colonial architecture, which disrupts the traditional space, the traditional gendered space. But look at the causality over here. The causality over here is a woman's space, a woman's freedom, a woman's agency, the woman's site. So that is the first thing to go, right? And so this causality becomes part of the problem. And again, it's quite symbolic in the sense that the village itself becomes a colonial mapping, a colonial site which is mapped endlessly. So the production of the colonial identity, production of the colonial building is closely related to the production of patriarchy. So we have patriarchy as a double engine over here. So there is a colonial patriarchy at work which controls the entire system, and of course there is domestic patriarchy inside the intimate space which doubly marginalizes the woman. The story locates more examples. Among them are Baba Mukura's inclination to barge in Tambu and Nyasha's room without knocking, so again male invasion in any female space, and his attempt to invade Nyasha's body-mind by insisting that she consume and submit to his maleness power, an ideology served as food. So food becomes a very important signifier where consuming food becomes also consuming authority, and being complicit to authority. So that food becomes a marker of authority, a marker of a certain kind of patriarchal privilege. So ideology, and so we can see there are a lot of very good research done on food and how the design of food, the taste of food, the recipe of food, the very ontology of food can be gendered in quality, can be discursive in quality, can be cultural in quality. So consumption of a certain kind of food or drink, for the matter, becomes a marker of a certain kind of identity formation and identity reproduction. So identity is iterated through the consumption of food. And in this particular case, ideology is iterated through consumption of a certain kind of food. So it's quite symbolic as an act of consumption. Add to those the fact that my guru has yet to get the house when she was promised, and in the homestead's spatial arrangement, my Nini sleeps on the reed made on the floor, while the bed and its mattress belong to Zeramir. During Christmas, the homestead is so crammed that relatives with relatives and gender ideological battles wait against females, that when the relatives finally leave, a sense of relief is achieved. As Tambu says, following their departure, a sigh escaped from us and we all felt oddly relieved. We remember how, in a related manner, in his malicious bid to undermine economically Tambu's project to grow maize and therefore raise money for his own education, Namo trespasses into Tambu's own plot, stealing her harvest and giving them away to her friends Neri and Chitswa and Rutivi at Rutivi school. Tambu ultimately overcomes both Namo's economic sabotage and other impediments to her quest for education and secures a place at the elite white school Sacred Heart. Now, the whole idea of growing a crop, of growing a certain kind of a commodity which can be sold, for paying for education, becomes again a symbolic attempt to assert an appropriate agency. And we can see how the men in the novel constantly try to sabotage the female agency, constantly try to interrupt and invade female agency. So we see Namo over here trespasses into Tambu's own plot. Again, I mean, the word plot over here can be read in many ways. It's a plot where a certain crop is grown. It's also a plot where the story happens. So it's her own story. She's weaving her own story. She's trying to make her own story. And Namo trespasses onto her story, trespasses into her crop. So plot becomes a double metaphor over here. And stealing her crop and selling it off to her friends. But ultimately, Tambu recovers that, achieves her agency, and goes to the elite white school, Sacred Heart. So again, that whiteness of the school, the elitism of the school becomes a site of subversion as well as emancipation. So that's a school which can set her free from the patriarchal trappings in a household. Tambu's admission to Sacred Heart allows Dangarembga to extend the motive of space and spatial congestion and to continue to denounce women's relegation to and the occupation of limited and restricted spaces under patriarchy and colonization. Admission to this elitist institution is nothing short of a remarkable personal achievement for Tambu when viewed in the context of how she makes it there. Colonization and white intellectual elitism, right? So that school becomes again marked by privilege, elitism, patriarchy, but of a different kind. So it's a movement across different kinds of spaces. The school becomes a different symbolic space over here, and that transition from the home to the school becomes a marker of Tambu's journey. However, Dangarembga points out that just as the expansive mission heaven congests in its massive interior furnishings and similarly limits female voices on account of Baba Mukuru's excessive impulse to control, Sacred Heart also confines in its provision of inadequate space for its female African students. So we can see how inequality and identity politics get mapped and replayed in different kinds of sites, different locations, different spaces. So on the one hand, we have the household of Baba Mukuru, where there's a grand patriarch and females are relegated, servants are relegated. So the patriarch controls the house, surveils everything that happens around him, and the kitchen remains unattended, damaged, etc. But even the admission to Sacred Heart doesn't stop patriarchy, and it just operates at a different level, right? So there's elitist spaces which is occupied, inhabited by the white students, whereas the African students, the African female students, who are doubly marginalized, they occupy a different space. So throughout the novel, we see how space plays such a key role in terms of the production and perpetuation of identity, especially in a colonial situation. Even with its exterior grounds, which Tambue describes as majestically spacious, this school, where a few Africans are assimilated into honorary and civilizing white spaces and required to know the little space, does not offer for its African students enough room, right? So again, the unavailability of space becomes a commentary on a certain kind of identity, right? So there's not enough room, there's not enough space. And the students are relegated to lesser spaces. And again, the production of lesser and greater spaces is obviously a commentary on how power gets played out and mapped out in different kind of discursive settings. So from the intimate domestic space to the big public school, there are these mappings of power, mappings of identity, mappings of locations through which identity, agency, privilege get played out in different complex combinations. In Tambue's dormitory room, 6 beds are squeezed into a space originally meant for 4 girls. So again, the claustrophobia continues. To Baba Mukuru's questioning of this stifling arrangement, the beautiful white nun replies proudly, "Ah yes, we have more Africans here than usual this year, so we had to put them all in here," right? So putting all Africans together, obviously it continues some kind of a racial profiling, a racial mapping. So the African students are put together, African girls are put together, they're so almost crammed together like cattle, whereas the white students, the colonial students, the colonizers, they have their students in a different room, a different dormitory, and that becomes an elitist space. So we have a clear case of mapping of spaces, profiling of spaces through gendered and racial identities. Neither benefactive nor prohibitive, nor probative, this colonial administrative judgment and congested spatial arrangement subtext powerfully the colonizer-colonized power relationships, which markedly favors the colonizer at the colonizer's expense, and most of all underscores hegemony's arrogance and power to confine, define, and exclude others. Right? So the politics of exclusion, the politics of confinement, the politics of coercion continue to be operative in different settings, public school settings, domestic settings, etc. The dynamic is extended, interestingly, also in Dangarembga's sarcastic employment of theological imagery in characterizing the human impendences, Baba Mukuru, and indirectly colonization and the white missionaries themselves as selfless providence, right? So the claim to selflessness, the claim to benevolence, the claim to charity is called into question throughout the novel. So, we can see how positions of power are discursively determined, socially engineered, and in the process, that controls power in sort of sometimes benevolent ways, but, sometimes insidious ways as well. Tambue sarcastically characterizes her uncle as a man of wealth and consequence, a man whose position, privilege, and power make him the closest thing a human could get to God, right? So again, the godlike quality is something which keeps coming back. Baba Mukuru is godlike because of his male patriarchal position. The creator of all things, an ultimate arbiter of good and evil. In his characteristic obsession with unilateral power and control, and in his assumption of an exclusive and excluding creator status, Baba Mukuru believes that he creates things alone, right? So again, that creator complex is there throughout the novel. He sees himself as a creator, someone who originates things alone. He makes that claim known in his memorable warning to Tambue. "I am the head of this house. Anyone who defies my authority is an evil thing in this house, bent on destroying what I have made," right? So this creator complex becomes interesting, and we can see how the trauma of the female over here is very much a part of the imposition of the male superior position, right? The position of superiority, which of course is socially engineered. So he claims that he's the head of the house and he creates everything in the house, and anyone who opposes him is a destroyer, right? Destroying what he had made, and that is seen as almost not just as an act of dissidence, but an act of transgression and sin. So there's almost a metaphysical quality about his claim of superiority, claim to this privileged patriarchy, right? That is almost metaphysical, it's almost spiritual in quality. And whoever calls that into question is seen as a sinner, as a transgressor, which requires punition. Dangarembga raises here the important issue of how women's, and speaking more broadly, other people's indispensable contributions to spaces of male hegemony's power are exploited and sometimes erased from male-centered or a supremacist historiography, right? So as you can see, historiography becomes an interesting thing over here. So the novel as a space also becomes interesting. So who occupies a central position in the novel is obviously determined by the discursive conditioning in the novel. So as you're talking about how the word plot, it sort of implies the place where the crop is grown as a harvest, which will then be used to pay for Tambu's education. But equally, it's also a site of the story, right? Plot. And then we see the male invasion in the female story, the story of becoming. So that has been invaded and intruded upon all the time. Right. In other words, and as demonstrated vividly in Jeremiah's claiming the honor of the repair of homestead kitchen done by Lucia and Tambu, women are sometimes denied credit for the work, comparable to how European opulence, its well-being and progress have been built up with the sweat and the dead bodies of blacks, Arabs, Indians, and the yellow races. And this is Fano, whose humanity and resources Europe exploited, demeans and effaces. Baba Mukuru hardly acknowledges Maiguru's part in its own opulence and supports creation. So the female is just a silent producer, the silent manufacturer, the silent slave, shall we say. Right, so the slavery of the woman is just very, very obvious over here. The female just silently supports the man. And the man is seen as a creator. The man takes all the claim to be the creator. Whereas the woman who help him and sometimes lead from the front in terms of creating something physically remain unacknowledged, remain unheeded too, remain unstated and unthanked. Okay. The truth is, he relies much on her sacrifices and support to him personally and the Sigurega family as a whole. Maiguru herself knows this, telling Tambu that her uncle Baba Mukuru is in fact wouldn't be able to do half the things he does if I didn't work as well. In addition, one cannot forget the house's domestic, the young girl Anna, who is always kneeling and disappearing as inconspicuously as she had arrived. So the inconspicuous presence of Anna is interesting over here because that is a pointer to her marginality, almost spectrality of the character. She is hardly a presence, almost a proxy presence, just comes, works and goes away and hardly arrives. And so inconspicuous you don't get to see her at all. So it's some kind of an invisible labor, invisible worker. And that you can make the connection between the kind of illegal immigrants working away in different places in wealthier countries and then disappearing whenever the police comes, disappearing whenever the patriarch comes, but then at the same time they're helping out in invisible ways. So the lack of visibility obviously is equated with the lack of agency, the absence of agency, so to speak. Baba Mukuru's house cannot operate efficiently without Anna's significant, though narratively subordinated role as maid and family career, and Sylvester's labor as house gardener. So you can see how Anna, the laborer, and Sylvester, the gardener, are equated with each other, and yet these are silent spectral presences who are never acknowledged, never brought to the fore, never brought to the center. They remain as marginalized spectral presences. And of course, the spectrality and silence become connected categories over here. Nor can extortionist Jeremiah survive without Mashiange's long, tiring labor and sacrifices, her bearing of the heavy burden of womanhood, a burden Tambu intends desperately to escape through a strive for colonial education, the perpetuated shaper of the native, relative to the encounter with the native whose destiny they claim to make imperialism or colonization, and the missionaries that occupy a God space in the story, as does Baba Mukuru. So I stop at this point today, and what we can see quite clearly is how godliness becomes a discursive design. Godliness or deification becomes a discursive design. It's a socially engineered, culturally engineered process, which is invested into making a certain figure or a certain position powerful, agentic, superior, authoritative. Right, and its authority is obviously, there's nothing metaphysical about it. The authority is entirely material. It is invested with ideological investments, ideological mappings. And we see the God space in the story is occupied by Bamakiru in the domestic space, and of course by the colonizer in the public space. But either way, the women stay as doubly marginalized, doubly victimized, doubly oppressed and repressed in the story. And the whole story is about the trauma, which is about the dailiness of discrimination, the dailiness of repression, the dailiness of disconnect, alienation. So that informs the trauma through a series of experiences which are Newtonian in quality. There's nothing extraordinary about the trauma where it just happens every single day. So the everydayness is literally what informs the marginalization, the spectrality, and the silences through which certain characters are positioned in the story. So I'll stop at this point today, and we'll continue with this in the next session. Thank you for your attention.